Greetings, dear friends. Fanatical Dragon back again, and here today with a film review, taking a look at Cine Asia's fairly recent release of Creation of the Gods Part 1, Kingdom of Storms, the first in a trilogy of 3 movies, all based on a huge, enormously successful powerhouse of a book in Chinese mythology and literature called Investiture of the Gods, written about, I think, 1567. And ultimately this is telling the very first part of that story, and the subsequent 2 films that will come out will kind of tell a largely condensed version of Investiture of the Gods, which is a very long, I think 100-volume sprawling epic tale, and they've done their best to kind of try and pick out the key moments of it and turn them into a trilogy of films. So working very much to the sort of Lord of the Rings template of production, and this is a huge production on an epic scale, so a cast of thousands in front of and behind of the camera. And I think actually the creatives visited New Zealand, met with Peter Jackson, and indeed hired one of the producers from Lord of the Rings, Barry M. Osborne, to work as a creative consultant on the project. So they shot all 3 parts together in one. I think a budget of over 100 million US dollars, which is huge for a Chinese movie. And ultimately they're going to release parts 2 and parts 3 once they finish the enormous amount of post-production. So I think we're getting part 2 is coming out next year, and then no word on the release date of part 3. But ultimately, if you're not familiar with the story, and I wasn't going into it, I'm more familiar with Journey to the West, the story of Monkey, and there is quite a lot of overlaps. A lot of the characters that feature in Journey to the West you do see here, though at very much a different time period. But essentially it tells the tale of the kind of rise and fall of King Zhu, and ultimately the decline of the Shang dynasty and the emergence of the Zhou dynasty. So set around about 1600 BC. And it's a great mix of kind of very large scale epic fight and battle sequences, and then quite a lot of kind of more intricate character based, loath to call it melodrama because there's still quite a lot happening, firmly placed in the fantasy realm. So we do see quite a lot of mythical creatures. We certainly see an interpretation of heaven, which is the thing that slightly tripped me out in terms of how it's been rendered and how it's been styled, but I think it's very much based off kind of traditional Chinese art that kind of told what those places or those environments might look like. And I think ultimately it's been incredibly successful, both financially in terms of China, but also as an adaptation. I think there's been a few different versions of this story that they've tried to kind of take into live action. Most recently back in 2016, I think there was a version called League of Gods starring Jet Li, which was not great. This is a very, very different kettle of fish. Very, very well performed, very well staged, beautifully directed, and the production design absolutely breathtaking. So the costumes and the production design, I think, were the main things that stood out for me. Cinematography too, both the digital cinematography for some of the visual effects and then some of the real world locations that they've gone to. But yeah, an amazing amount of work has kind of gone into bringing it to the big screen. A very large, very big ensemble cast, so I'm going to struggle to sort of tell you about all of them, and I don't want to spoil the story too much, but we'll kind of certainly take a little look at some of the ones that stood out the most for me. So I'm playing the king. We have Fei Zhang, he's playing King Jinchu. I think he was former pop star, I think American born. So he does have a Western name, but I kind of knew him by his Chinese name, by Fei Zhang. And he does a great job of being this tyrannical ruler. His consort, he's ultimately kind of besotted with a fox spirit that's taken over the body of this young girl. That character's called Su Daiji, and it's been played by Narana Erdeneva. I think a Mongolian Russian former model, and she does a great job of portraying the fox spirit that leads him astray. And then on the hero side, we have three kind of gods or immortals sent down from Kunlun, from heaven, to try and ultimately restore balance. The main one, Zhang Jia, played by Hong Bo, is incredible. Quite a lot of aging effect makeup on him, so we see him younger when he's in heaven and then older when he's down on earth. And he's joined by 2 gods. And Necha, who's one of the characters I was most familiar with. Necha had his own wonderful animated movie back in 2018, 2019, which I highly recommend. It's very, very good. And even going back to the Shaw Brothers days, we saw a version of the Necha story with Alexander Fusheng, directed by Chang Che. So for those of you that have seen any of those productions, you'll certainly recognise Necha here, though he's in his more sort of child-aged form here. So he's played by a very, very young character, a very young boy actor called Yafan Wu, who does a spectacular job of bringing Necha to life. And he is partnered with Zhang Jiang, who's been played by Xisha, and the 2 of them ultimately are kind of really trying to help Zhang Jia to kind of restore balance to the earth and try and ultimately find a new, more benevolent ruler who can ultimately take control and basically get rid of the evil king who doesn't really kind of want to doesn't really want to follow the right path. I think that's maybe all I would say, because I don't want to spoil the beats for you, because it is a pretty dense story and we're not getting all of it here. So like I say, this is only part one, but the film does a really good job of not leaving us on too much of a cliffhanger. There's a good mix of action and drama and story, beautifully well acted, and it looks absolutely incredible. The production design really is a standout element for me, and it was really interesting going through on the Blu-ray. There's about an hour and 20 minutes worth of behind the scenes. We kind of get to see an awful lot of the work that went into building the enormous sets, and then also the sort of set extensions they've done through CG, and then some of the real locations that they went to. I think For Heaven was the one I didn't know how to take at first when I saw it. But after a little bit of research and diving back into some of the goodies that came with my Necha set, this sort of style of kind of traditional Chinese illustration, where they kind of represented what heaven potentially might look like. There was a very famous painter who I think had made a painting called 1000 Li of Rivers and Mountains, and it looks like that's been a big inspiration on how they've portrayed their kind of image of how heaven would look like. So I think it's fairly accurate to Chinese art. To westernize that part of it, the CG might look a bit strange to you. On second viewing, it didn't really faze me as much. I think it was just seeing something that you have no basis for in reality, but all the stuff that was actually on the ground in the real world looked absolutely spectacular, but beautifully well realized in terms of digitally. The other actors that kind of really made quite a big impression are sort of young male leads. So Jifa, who is ultimately going to be the one who I think does ascend to take control. It's Jifa historically who would establish the Zhao dynasty. So I suspect he's going to be a fairly large part of 2 and 3 moving forward. His father also has a large part to play. His father Ji Jiang, aka the Duke of the West, appears here, played by Liu Zhizhan, and he's also absolutely fantastic in the film. Wonderful voice, and kind of the relationship between him and his son, and ultimately kind of how they reconnect, because his son has been raised basically under the control of the evil king. There was a practice at that point in time where they would send the sons to the rivals, ultimately as a way of kind of trying to maintain the peace, with the idea that you wouldn't invade your neighbour's land if he was looking after your kid, I think was the sort of logic behind it. So yeah, the Duke of the West's son, Jifa, has been raised by the kind of evil king, and ultimately has to kind of see him for who he really is, and then decide to kind of go out on his own and fight back. And that's about as much as I'm going to say about the story. I think if you're remotely a fan of any sort of fantasy movie, if you're a fan of any sort of Chinese historical epics, or if you're just a fan of epic war movies in general, I think there's an awful lot to really enjoy here. If you don't get a chance to dive into the Blu-ray, which I would highly suggest you do for the behind-the-scenes stuff, it's great seeing this amount on a Cine release. I think over an hour is quite rare for one of their releases, but I think the size of the production definitely warrants it. And there's little individual featurettes on a whole bunch of different aspects of the production. So we're going to see ones on set design, ones on the cinematography, ones on the visual effects, and so on. There's about 10 of these in total, and go up to, like I say, about an hour and 20 minutes, which are all really interesting, all with English subs. The English subtitles of the movie are amazing. I'd first seen this as a digital version, not from Cine Asia, I hasten to add, and the subtitles were really bad, so it was very confusing the first time I watched it. Rewatching it through on the Cine Asia version was infinitely more easy to understand what was actually going on and follow the beats. So yeah, highly recommended for me. It was a film that I really enjoyed, and find myself looking forward to part 2. I'm intrigued to see where the story goes. There are a couple of post-credit sequences, so don't turn off as soon as you hit the credits. Stay for the end, because there's a mid-credits and then an end-credit sequence, which is led, I suspect, to some American viewers purely on that front, trying to compare it to the kind of Marvel universe, as if this is somehow the beginning of an MCU-like universe of movies. That's not the case. I think Lord of the Rings is a much more appropriate analogy, given that it's based on a very well-regarded, well-loved book. It's trying its best to adapt a very large, very dense book into kind of a narrative movie that actually somehow makes sense and does justice to the source material, and I think this absolutely has been successful in that regard. So yeah, don't think of it as being like China's answer to Marvel. I would see it more as China's response to the Lord of the Rings on a production point of view, but telling very much a Chinese story authentically, really. And yeah, one that I thoroughly enjoyed. So 2 thumbs way up for me. Thank you very much to Cine Asia for supplying me with a review copy. I cannot wait to see part 2. I've been the Fanatical Dragon. Thank you so much for joining me for this. I will see you on the next one. Take care.